London, December 1952. Temperatures drop close to freezing. The wind is almost completely still. What begins as an ordinary winter fog quickly turns into a dense, toxic smog that starts to settle over the city. By evening, visibility falls to just a few meters. Transport begins to stop. People lose their sense of direction in the streets. And this is only the beginning. Today, we will break down how a combination of weather, industry, and human decisions led to one of the most dangerous episodes in the history of urban air. If you are listening right now, write in the comments where you are from and what time it is for you. It is always interesting to see where these stories are being heard. If you enjoy this calm and thoughtful format, consider subscribing. Here, we explore real events step by step without unnecessary drama. This is not a fictional reconstruction. This is the real story of the Great Smog. The meteorological trap. To understand the catastrophe that unfolded in London during December 1952, we must first examine the invisible mechanics of the atmosphere. The Great Smog was not merely a result of pollution, but a perfect intersection of geography, urban activity, and a rare weather phenomenon. On Thursday, December 4, 1952, a massive high-pressure system, known as an anticyclone, drifted over the British Isles from the south and east. By evening, the center of this system had settled directly over the Thames Valley. This was the beginning of the meteorological trap. In a standard atmospheric profile, air temperature decreases as altitude increases. Under these normal conditions, the air near the ground is warmed by the Earth, becomes less dense, and naturally rises. This process of convection is the primary way a city breathes. It carries smoke, vehicle exhaust, and industrial gases into the upper atmosphere, where they are dispersed by stronger winds. However, the anticyclone of December 4th introduced a phenomenon called a temperature inversion. As the sun set that Thursday, the sky was unusually clear. This allowed the heat of the ground to radiate rapidly into space. Consequently, the surface of the Earth cooled at an accelerated rate, chilling the layer of air directly in contact with it. At the same time, the air within the core of the anticyclone was slowly descending. As air sinks in a high-pressure system, it undergoes adiabatic compression, which causes it to warm up. This created a layer of warm air sitting directly on top of the cold, dense air at the surface. By the early hours of Friday, December 5th, this warm layer had descended to an altitude of only 100 to 200 feet above the streets of London. This created a physical barrier. The warm air acted like a lid on a pot, sealing the city and its emissions into a very small, confined space. In meteorological terms, the mixing depth, which is the vertical height available for pollutants to disperse, had vanished. Geography played a critical role in magnifying this effect. London sits within the Thames Valley, a natural basin surrounded by hills to the north and south. This topography meant that the cold, stagnant air was physically cradled by the land. On December 5th, the pressure gradient was so weak that the wind speed dropped to near zero. Instruments at the Kew Observatory and at Heathrow recorded a state of absolute calm. Without horizontal wind to push the air out of the valley, and without vertical convection to lift it over the inversion lid, the air over London became a stationary pool. This pool of air was not only still, but it was also reaching its dew point. As the temperature at the ground dropped to approximately 30 degrees Fahrenheit, or 0 degrees Celsius, the relative humidity climbed to 100%. This triggered the formation of a thick radiation fog. Under normal circumstances, a white fog is composed of pure water droplets. However, London in 1952 was a city powered almost entirely by coal. Every home, office, and factory began to pump its morning emissions into this freezing, humid, and trapped layer of air. As the coal smoke rose from millions of chimneys, it hit the inversion boundary at 150 feet and stopped. It could go no further. The smoke began to spread out horizontally, filling the space between the ground and the lid. The chemistry of the air began to change rapidly. The water droplets of the fog began to absorb the sulfur dioxide and soot particles being emitted at street level. This transformed a natural weather event into a toxic soup. The particles of soot gave the fog a yellow and black tint, while providing a surface for chemical reactions to occur. Data from the time indicates that the barometric pressure remained exceptionally high, holding steady at approximately 1,030 millibars. This high pressure prevented any incoming weather fronts from breaking the stagnation. To the residents of London waking up on the morning of Friday, December 5th, the day appeared unusually dark and cold, but there was little immediate alarm. Londoners were used to the pea soupers of the past. They did not yet realize that the inversion lid was locked tight, and that the volume of toxic gases was increasing with every passing minute. The technical reality was that London had become a closed system. Every pound of fuel burned was now contributing to a rising concentration of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and sulfur dioxide that had nowhere to go. By midday on December 5th, the visibility in central London began to drop towards zero. The physical trap was complete. The weather had created the container, and the city was now filling it with poison. This meteorological configuration would remain unchanged for 4 consecutive days, setting the stage for the greatest environmental disaster in British history. In December 1952, the British economy was dictated by a singular, non-negotiable necessity: the mass extraction and consumption of coal to settle post-war debts and fuel a struggling industrial recovery. While the high-pressure anticyclone provided the physical container for the disaster, the contents of that container were the direct result of a decade of economic austerity and a specific government policy regarding domestic fuel distribution. In the early 1950s, coal was not merely a utility, it was the fundamental architecture of British life, responsible for over 90% of the nation's heating and nearly all of its electricity generation. The system of energy production in London at the time relied on a fragmented but massive network of local infrastructure. There were 2 primary tiers of consumption: the large-scale industrial plants, such as the Battersea and Bankside power stations, and the estimated 3.5 million domestic open hearths scattered across the metropolitan area. Under normal conditions, the high chimneys of the power stations were designed to loft emissions into the upper air currents, while the smaller domestic chimneys contributed a steady but manageable amount of smoke to the city's skyline. However, the economic reality of 1952 forced a change in the quality of the fuel being fed into these systems. To understand the severity of the 1952 smog, one must analyze the specific grade of fuel known as nutty slack. Following the nationalization of the coal industry in 1947, the British government faced a desperate need for hard currency. High-quality, low-sulfur coal, known as brights, was designated as a premium export product to be sold to Europe and the United States to help pay off war loans. This left the domestic market with a severe shortage of clean-burning fuel. To fill this gap, the Ministry of Fuel and Power introduced nutty slack in late 1952. This was a low-grade mixture consisting of small pieces of coal, or nuts, mixed with a high proportion of slack, which was essentially coal dust, shale, and dirt scraped from the floor of the mines. The technical composition of nutty slack was disastrous for urban air quality. While high-grade anthracite might contain less than 1% sulfur, the low-grade coal being burned in London homes in December 1952 had a sulfur content frequently exceeding 3 to 4%. Furthermore, the high ash and mineral content in nutty slack meant that it did not burn efficiently. In a standard Victorian or Edwardian open fireplace, which was the primary heating source for most Londoners, the combustion efficiency was remarkably low, approximately 15 to 20%. The remaining 80% of the energy potential was wasted, escaping up the chimney in the form of unburned carbon particles, heavy tars, and gaseous sulfur dioxide. The escalation of the crisis was driven by a simple thermodynamic requirement. As the temperature under the December inversion dropped toward freezing, the demand for heat rose exponentially. Because nutty slack had a lower calorific value than standard coal, residents had to burn significantly larger volumes of it to maintain a habitable temperature in their drafty, poorly insulated brick homes. Records from the National Coal Board suggest that by Friday, December the 5th, The rate of coal consumption in London had surged to nearly 2,000 tons per day. This created a massive ground-level release of pollutants that were far more chemically complex and physically dense than standard coal smoke. A technical deep dive into the emissions reveals that for every ton of this low-grade coal burned, approximately 20 to 30 kilograms of sulfur dioxide were released into the atmosphere. Under the stagnant conditions of the inversion, this sulfur dioxide encountered the high humidity of the Thames Valley. Through a process of aqueous phase oxidation, the sulfur dioxide reacted with the water droplets in the fog to form dilute sulfuric acid. The soot particles from the nutty slack acted as catalysts for this reaction, providing a surface where the chemical transformation could occur more rapidly. The result was not just a fog of smoke, but an aerosol of acid, a suspension of liquid droplets that were small enough to be inhaled deep into the human respiratory system. The real-world impact of this infrastructure was a total saturation of the urban environment. London's housing stock was almost entirely dependent on individual room heating rather than centralized systems. This meant there were millions of individual point sources of pollution, all discharging at a height of only 20 to 30 feet above the sidewalk. Because the nutty slack was off-ration, meaning it could be purchased more easily than higher-quality fuels, it became the default choice for a population still living under the shadow of post-war rationing. The economic pressure to export the good coal effectively mandated that the capital city be heated by the least efficient and most toxic material available. The synthesis of these factors created a lethal intersection between national macroeconomics and local meteorology. The government's drive for export revenue ignored the environmental capacity of the Thames Basin to absorb the waste products of low-grade combustion. There was no regulatory framework to limit domestic emissions, and the clean air movement was still a fringe concept in a country focused on industrial survival. The infrastructure of coal was a rigid system that could not be switched off or modified when the weather turned. It was a massive, slow-moving machine that, once ignited, would continue to pump thousands of tons of acid and soot into the air, regardless of the atmospheric conditions. As the morning of Friday, December the 5th progressed, the synergy between the nutty slack emissions and the temperature inversion reached a critical threshold. The yellowish fog, already thickening, began to take on a pungent, acrid smell, an olfactory warning of the sulfuric acid building up in the air. The meteorological trap was now filled with a chemical payload that the city's population was about to encounter in full force. The transition from a cold, foggy morning to a state of total urban paralysis was about to begin as the first 24 hours of the Great Smog unfolded. This movement toward total breakdown started at street level, where the visibility began to collapse in real time, signaling the start of the first true day of the catastrophe. By 6 o'clock on Friday, December the 5th, 1952, the visibility at the London airport in Heathrow had been recorded at less than 12 yards. This measurement was a critical indicator of a rapidly deteriorating atmospheric situation that was now spreading from the outskirts into the heart of the capital. As the city's population of 8 million people began to wake, the temperature at ground level hovered at a constant 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The high-pressure system established the previous evening had successfully suppressed all vertical air movement, creating a stagnant volume of air that was about to undergo a radical chemical transformation. The transition from a standard winter mist to the lethal pea super began in earnest during the morning commute. Under normal circumstances, a fog consists primarily of water droplets that scatter light, creating a white or grayish haze. However, as millions of Londoners stoked their coal fires for the morning, the chemistry of the air shifted. The soot and tarry vapors from nutty slack coal did not merely mix with the fog, they became part of its structure. These carbonaceous particles, often less than 2 micrometers in diameter, began to coat the water droplets. This coating reduced the rate of evaporation and gave the fog its characteristic yellowish-green hue, a color historically described by Londoners as pea soup, but which was technically a dense suspension of industrial waste. By 9 o'clock, the sun had risen, but it was invisible from the street level. Technical data from the St. Bartholomew's Hospital monitoring station showed that the concentration of smoke particles had already climbed to 3 times its normal winter average. In the City of London and the East End, the density of the air was becoming a physical obstacle. Commuters reported that the air had a greasy texture and a distinct acrid taste. This was the result of sulfur dioxide gas reacting with moisture to form a mild sulfuric acid aerosol. The pea super was no longer just a visual phenomenon. It was an acidic cloud that began to irritate the membranes of the eyes, nose, and throat of everyone outdoors. As the clock reached midday, the escalation of the crisis became undeniable. In central locations like Piccadilly Circus and Fleet Street, the typical midday light was replaced by a surreal subterranean gloom. Street lamps, which had been turned on automatically or by hand, appeared as dim amber smudges that were invisible from more than 5 paces away. Logbooks from the Metropolitan Police indicate that by 12:30, officers were being issued flares and torches to guide traffic. But even these high-intensity light sources failed to penetrate the thickening mass. The pea super had reached a level of opacity where the human eye could no longer distinguish between the sidewalk and the road. A technical deep dive into the air quality during these first 24 hours reveals a staggering accumulation of mass. On a typical clear day, London's air contained approximately 0.2 milligrams of smoke per cubic meter. By the afternoon of December the 5th, this figure had spiked to over 1.5 milligrams in many districts. More dangerously, the concentration of sulfur dioxide was rising in parallel, reaching levels of 0.7 parts per million. This was not just a collection of smoke. It was a concentrated dose of respiratory irritants held in place by the lid of the temperature inversion. The water droplets in the air were now so saturated with soot that they became black rain when they settled on clothing or skin. The real-world impact by late afternoon was a state of increasing confusion and rising fear. The visual disappearance of the city led to a total breakdown of spatial orientation. People exiting underground stations found themselves unable to find their way across familiar squares. Hospital records from the afternoon of December the 5th show the first wave of fog-related admissions. These were not yet the mass casualties of the peak crisis, but rather individuals with pre-existing conditions like asthma or chronic bronchitis who were experiencing immediate respiratory distress. The acrid air was triggering bronchospasms, a tightening of the airways that made every breath a mechanical struggle. The synthesis of economic activity and weather during this period created a relentless cycle. Businesses remained open, factories continued to burn fuel, and the evening commute added a new surge of pollutants into the air. The pea super was effectively a closed-loop system where every hour of human activity made the environment more toxic. Unlike a natural fog that might burn off with the heat of the sun, this smog was self-reinforcing. By blocking the sun, it maintained the cold temperatures at ground level, which in turn maintained the temperature inversion and the need for more coal fires. By 8 p.m., the first 24 hours of the crisis were nearing their conclusion, and the city was entering a state of unprecedented isolation. The pea super had moved inside. The smoke was so fine and the pressure so consistent that it began to seep through the gaps in window frames and under doors. Even in the supposedly clean air of a living room, a haze began to form. Theater performances were canceled, not because the actors couldn't get to the stage, but because the audience couldn't see the stage through the fog that had filled the auditorium. The day ended with a terrifying realization for the city's authorities. The smog was not lifting, it was thickening. The meteorological data showed no change in the high-pressure system, and the pea super was now a semi-solid wall of toxins stretching from the ground up to the height of the chimney pots. London was no longer a moving, functioning city. It was a collection of isolated individuals trapped in a dark, acidic void. As the first day drew to a close, the city's transport network, the very veins of the capital, began to succumb to the total loss of visibility. The morning of December the 6th would not bring relief, but rather the beginning of a total functional collapse. The P-Super had conquered the streets, and now it was moving to shut down the entire mechanism of urban movement. The transition from a sensory nightmare to a logistical catastrophe was now inevitable. By 8 a.m. on Saturday, December 6, 1952, the visibility in central London had officially dropped to less than 1 meter, or approximately 3 feet, rendering the most sophisticated urban transport network in the world completely obsolete. This was the moment the Great Smog transitioned from a meteorological event into a total systemic failure of the city's physical movement. The dense, oily aerosol had reached a concentration where light could no longer penetrate the atmosphere, effectively blindfolding every pilot, driver, and navigator within a 30-mile or 48-kilometer radius of Charing Cross. In the mid-20th century, London's pulse was maintained by a synchronized system of over 8,000 diesel-powered buses, a sprawling network of steam and electric overground trains, and the heavy commercial traffic of the River Thames. Under normal winter conditions, these systems operated through established fog protocols, which included reduced speeds and the use of powerful magnesium filament lamps. The London Underground, running deep beneath the surface, served as the city's fail-safe, largely unaffected by surface weather conditions. However, by the morning of December 6th, the sheer density of the particulate matter overthrew these safety margins, creating an environment where the very concept of navigation became impossible. The collapse began on the roads. By 10 a.m., visibility was so poor that bus drivers could no longer see the edge of their own vehicles' hoods, or bonnets, which extended only 2 meters, or 6 feet, in front of the steering wheel. To maintain any movement at all, bus conductors were forced to dismount and walk ahead of the vehicles, carrying flaming paraffin torches, or flares, to guide the drivers toward the curb. This human-paced navigation reduced the average speed of the city to less than 2 miles per hour, or 3 kilometers per hour. By 12 p.m., the London Transport Executive made the unprecedented decision to withdraw all bus services from the streets. For the first time since the heavy bombings of the Second World War, the red icons of London's mobility were ordered back to their depots. Many were simply abandoned mid-route as drivers found it impossible to even find the garage entrances. The paralysis was not merely a matter of human sight. It was a mechanical failure of the machines themselves. Internal combustion engines require a specific air-to-fuel ratio to function efficiently. The air being pulled into the intakes of diesel buses and delivery trucks was heavily saturated with nutty slack soot and oily tar. These particulates rapidly clogged air filters, leading to engine suffocation and stalling. Furthermore, the high concentration of sulfur dioxide began to react with the moisture on electrical contact points. In the damp, acidic air, the insulation on spark plug leads and distributor caps began to track or short-circuit. On the overground rail lines, the problem was even more technical. The electric third rail systems experienced intense arcing as the greasy soot created a semiconductive layer over the ceramic insulators, leading to power surges and localized blackouts across the southern and eastern regions. The crisis extended into the sky, isolating London from the rest of the world. At Heathrow Airport, then known as London Airport, and Northolt Aerodrome, visibility was recorded as 00. By 2 p.m., all flights were grounded. This was not a localized closure. The anticyclone had spread the smog across an area of nearly 1,000 square miles, or 2,600 square kilometers. Aircraft that were already airborne were forced to divert to as far away as Paris or Prestwick in Scotland, as every secondary landing strip in the southeast of England was submerged in the black soup. The technical limitation was the lack of instrument landing systems, ILS, capable of handling zero visibility conditions in 1952. The radar technology of the time was unable to distinguish between the ground and the ultra-dense, moisture-laden air mass sitting upon it. On the River Thames, the situation was lethal. The river was the primary artery for coal deliveries to the power stations. Without the ability to see the navigational buoys or the outlines of the bridges, tugboats and barges were forced to drop anchor wherever they sat. The Port of London Authority recorded a total cessation of movement by 4 p.m. The technical risk of a collision in the narrow tidal reaches of the Thames was too high, as even the most powerful searchlights could not penetrate more than a few feet or meters of the sulfuric aerosol. This total paralysis created a dangerous paradox. As the transport system died, the city's demand for resources increased. Without the arrival of coal barges and delivery trucks, the fuel reserves of the city began to dwindle precisely when they were needed most to combat the cold, which remained at a steady -1 degree Celsius, 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The interaction between the weather and the infrastructure had created a static environment. London was no longer a functioning city. It had become a series of isolated, disconnected islands. People who had ventured out for work in the morning found themselves stranded, unable to find their way home even if they lived only a few hundred yards or meters away. The cessation of mechanical noise brought a terrifying, unnatural silence to the streets, broken only by the coughing of pedestrians lost in the gloom. But as the sun set on December 6, the inability to move became more than an inconvenience. It became a death sentence for those who needed urgent help. The smog was no longer just blocking the roads. It was starting to kill the people trapped upon them, and the emergency services were now as blind as the citizens they were meant to save. The city had become a labyrinth where even the most familiar streets were unrecognizable. As the mechanical world stood still, the focus shifted from the failure of machines to the failure of human perception, as Londoners began to lose their orientation in a world where visibility had reached absolute zero. By 8 p.m. on Saturday, December 6th, the optical density of the smog reached a point where the visual range was officially recorded as 0 feet or 0 meters across the majority of the London urban core. The city had transitioned from a state of impaired movement to a state of total sensory deprivation. In this environment, the standard human mechanism for spatial orientation, visual landmarks, and depth perception suffered a complete systemic collapse. The air was no longer a transparent medium. It had become a physical, opaque barrier that absorbs nearly 100% of available light. The core mechanism of this phenomenon lies in the physics of light extinction. In a natural fog, visibility is reduced by the scattering of light by water droplets, a process known as scattering. However, the 1952 smog was not a simple water-based aerosol. It was a dense suspension of carbon black and tarry particulates. Carbon particles are highly efficient absorbers of light. Instead of reflecting light back to the observer, the soot absorbed the photons, effectively killing the light from street lamps and torches. This meant that increasing the power of a light source did not improve visibility. It merely created a blinding, localized glare that could not penetrate more than a few inches or centimeters into the gloom. The breakdown of human navigation was immediate and profound. Eyewitness accounts from the Metropolitan Police and civilian diaries describe a phenomenon where individuals lost all sense of direction within 10 feet or 3 meters of their own front doors. Without the ability to see the ground or the surrounding architecture, the vestibular system of the inner ear becomes the primary source of balance, but it cannot provide directional data. People reported walking in circles in their own gardens, or finding themselves in the middle of a busy road without realizing they had left the sidewalk or pavement. The pea souper had stripped the population of their cognitive map of the city. A technical deep dive into the reports from the 5th and 6th of December reveals that the extinction coefficient of the atmosphere was at its historical peak. Meteorological observers at the time used a system of visibility objects at known distances to measure range. By the evening of the second day, even the most powerful Beckley oil lamps, designed for maritime navigation and positioned at a distance of only 10 feet or 3 meters, were invisible. The concentration of suspended matter had reached approximately 4.5 milligrams per cubic meter, a level that physically altered the refractive index of the air. This created an effect where sounds became muffled and distorted, further disorienting those trapped outside. The high density of the aerosol acted as an acoustic dampener, making it impossible to judge the distance or direction of approaching vehicles or shouting voices. The real-world impact of this visibility zero state was a surge in accidental injuries and deaths, unrelated to respiratory failure. Hospital records from the Royal London Hospital and St. Thomas's identify a specific spike in trauma by disorientation. Pedestrians, unable to see the edge of the Thames embankment, walked directly into the freezing river. At least one account describes a man who spent 5 hours wandering a small park in South London, unable to find the exit until he literally stumbled into a perimeter fence. The most striking evidence of this collapse was the emergence of the blind guides. Reports from the time confirm that blind individuals, who were accustomed to navigating the city using tactile and auditory cues, became the only people capable of movement. Sighted people were seen clinging to the coats of blind neighbors, who led them through the blackness, using their canes to feel the texture of the pavement and the edges of buildings. The police response to this chaos was a desperate exercise in manual signaling. The Metropolitan Police Department realized early on that their standard patrols were useless. The traditional white sleeve uniforms worn by traffic officers were invisible in the smog. To manage the remaining foot traffic and the few abandoned vehicles blocking the thoroughfares, officers were issued flare lamps and torches fueled by paraffin. They stood at major intersections, like Piccadilly Circus and Elephant and Castle, swinging these lanterns in wide arcs to warn pedestrians of obstacles. However, the police were also victims of the environment. Official records show that many officers had to be rescued after becoming lost on their own beats. The communication system, dependent on visual confirmation and the movement of dispatchers, failed completely. The synthesis of these factors created a psychological state of urban isolation. The interaction between the meteorological inversion and the technical failure of light meant that every Londoner was essentially trapped in a sensory vacuum. The economic activity of the city had ceased, not because of a strike or a war, but because the physical link between 2 points in space had been severed. This was a unique moment in history where a modern industrial society was forced to revert to tactile navigation, feeling their way along walls and railings like characters in a pre-industrial nightmare. As the second night of the crisis deepened, the inability to see began to merge with the inability to breathe. The zero visibility conditions were not just a barrier to movement, they were a sign that the concentration of acidic particles had reached its lethal zenith. The paralysis of the city's transport and emergency services meant that when the respiratory systems of the elderly and the vulnerable began to fail, help would be unable to reach them. The darkness was no longer just a visual problem. It was the precursor to a mass mortality event. With the city's pulse stopped and its eyes blinded, the toxic aerosol began to penetrate the last remaining sanctuaries. The smog was no longer staying in the streets. It was moving into the very structures designed to keep the environment at bay, as the fine particles of soot and acid began their silent invasion of London's interior spaces. By the evening of Saturday, December 6th, the traditional concept of the indoor sanctuary had effectively vanished across the 700 square miles, or 1,800 square kilometers, of the London metropolitan area. As the atmospheric pressure outside remained at a staggering 1,030 millibars, the toxic aerosol began to equalize with indoor environments, penetrating the architectural defenses of hospitals, theaters, and private residences. This was not a result of open windows or negligence, but a consequence of the fundamental physics of gas exchange and the specific particulate profile of the nutty slack combustion products. The primary mechanism for this invasion was the stack effect, or chimney effect, which is inherent to the design of mid-20th century British architecture. In December 1952, the vast majority of London's 2 million homes relied on coal-fired hearths for warmth. As these fires burned, they consumed oxygen from the room and exhausted hot air up the chimney flue. This created a localized area of low pressure inside the living spaces. To equalize this pressure, the building inhaled replacement air from the outside through every available orifice, under door frames, through sash window gaps, and through porous brickwork. Because the outdoor air was saturated with a smoke concentration exceeding 4 milligrams per cubic meter, each home became a vacuum pump, actively pulling the poison into its interior. The technical deep dive into this process reveals the importance of particle size distribution. The soot produced by the incomplete combustion of low-grade coal consists of ultrafine particulates, specifically those To put this in perspective, a human hair is approximately 50 to 70 micrometers wide. Particles of this size do not behave like larger dust. They behave almost like gas molecules. They are subject to Brownian motion, a random, jittery movement caused by collisions with air molecules, which allows them to remain suspended indefinitely and navigate the most microscopic structural gaps. Furthermore, the Great Smog was not merely a dry smoke, but a liquid-phase aerosol. The 100% relative humidity meant that each soot particle was encased in a microscopic droplet of water. As these droplets were drawn into the warmer indoor environment, the water began to evaporate, leaving behind a concentrated, naked core of carbon and adsorbed sulfuric acid. This process, known as evaporative concentration, made the indoor smog potentially more irritating to the respiratory tract than the outdoor version, as the acidic components became more undiluted upon entering a heated room. By 9 p.m. on December 6th, the real-world impact of this infiltration became surreal. In the West End, the Sadler's Wells Theatre was forced to abandon a performance of the opera La Traviata. The smog had seeped into the auditorium in such volumes that the audience in the gallery could no longer see the performers on the stage, despite being only 60 feet or 18 meters away. The indoor visibility was so poor that the singing was stopped mid-act because the conductor could not see his orchestra. Similar reports emerged from cinemas across the city, where the beams from the film projectors were scattered so aggressively by the indoor soot that the images on the screen became a gray, flickering blur. In the city's hospitals, the situation reached a critical technical failure. Operating theaters, which required high levels of sterility and clear sightlines, were compromised. Surgeons reported that the black air hung in the wards like a physical curtain. The fine soot particles settled on sterilized instruments and open wounds, introducing industrial carbon and sulfur directly into clinical environments. Because the 1952 ventilation systems lacked the HEPA filtration technology common in modern medicine, there was no mechanical way to scrub the air. Hospital records indicate that the indoor concentration of sulfur dioxide reached approximately 70 to 80% of the outdoor levels within 4 hours of the inversion's peak. The synthesis of these factors meant that for the 8 million people of London, there was no away. The interaction between the thermal requirements of the population, the need to stay warm, and the physics of air infiltration created a trap within a trap. By burning more coal to combat cold, residents were accelerating the rate at which their own homes were being filled with toxins. The chemical interaction was not limited to the lungs. The acidic smog began to react with indoor surfaces. It tarnished silver, rotted curtains, and left a greasy sulfuric film on every piece of furniture. The psychological and physiological toll of this indoor eclipse cannot be overstated. By 12 a.m. on Sunday, December 7th, the distinction between inside and outside had been functionally erased. People were going to sleep in bedrooms where the air was as toxic as a factory floor. This constant 24-hour exposure meant that the human body had no window for recovery. The cumulative dose of sulfur and carbon was reaching a lethal threshold for those with pre-existing heart and lung conditions. As the smog continued to thicken and the indoor air became increasingly unbreathable, the city's healthcare infrastructure began to experience the first wave of what would become a mass casualty event. The next 12 hours would see the meteorological trap and the infrastructure of coal translate into a clinical crisis that would overwhelm every doctor and nurse in the British capital. The silent invasion of the city's buildings was the final precursor to the collapse of the human body. As the toxins reached the deepest recesses of the city's homes and hospitals, the medical system was about to face a surge of patients that no emergency plan had ever anticipated. By 8 a.m. on Sunday, December 7, 1952, the London healthcare infrastructure, barely 4 years into its existence as the National Health Service, faced a surge of acute respiratory failure that exceeded the peak of any 20th century influenza epidemic. The meteorological trap had now been in place for over 72 hours, and the cumulative biological load of sulfur and carbon on the city's 8 million inhabitants reached a critical threshold. The hospital system, designed to manage seasonal fluctuations, began to fracture under the weight of a population that was, quite literally, being dissolved from the inside out. The human respiratory system normally operates a highly efficient filtration mechanism. The bronchial tubes are lined with microscopic, hair-like structures called cilia, which move in a rhythmic wave to clear mucus and trapped particles out of the lungs. However, the technical nature of the 1952 smog bypassed this primary defense. The high concentration of sulfur dioxide in the stagnant air reacted with the moisture on the surface of the bronchial mucosa to form dilute sulfuric acid. This acidic environment paralyzed the cilia, stopping the mucociliary escalator and allowing the deep-penetrating nutty slack soot particles to settle directly into the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where oxygen exchange occurs. The clinical breakdown was immediate and widespread. By 10 a.m., general practitioners across the East End reported a 400% increase in emergency home visits. Patients were presenting with smog syndrome, a combination of intense retrosternal pain, violent coughing fits producing black phlegm, and cyanosis, a bluish tint to the skin indicating severe oxygen deprivation. In technical terms, the irritant nature of the acidic aerosol triggered massive bronchospasm, causing the airways to constrict. For those with pre-existing conditions like chronic bronchitis or emphysema, this constriction led to acute cor pulmonale, a form of right-sided heart failure caused by the extreme pressure required to pump blood through the inflamed, oxygen-starved lungs. The London ambulance service faced a technical impossibility. By 12 p.m., the zero-visibility conditions described in previous chapters meant that ambulances could no longer navigate the streets at speeds faster than a walking pace. Drivers were forced to operate with their doors open, leaning out to see the curb, while attendants walked ahead with torches. A journey of 2 miles, or 3.2 kilometers, which usually took 8 minutes, now took over 2 hours. This delay meant that many patients reached a state of irreversible respiratory arrest before the ambulance could even arrive. By 2 p.m., the LAS was receiving over 300 calls per hour, yet only a fraction of the fleet was able to move. Inside the hospitals, the crisis was exacerbated by the indoor smog phenomenon. Wards at St. Bartholomew's and Guy's Hospital were filled with a visible, acrid mist that even the most rigorous cleaning could not remove. Nurses reported that the air inside the buildings was so thick that they had to feel their way between beds to administer oxygen. Oxygen supplies, a critical technical resource, began to run dangerously low. In 1952, oxygen was delivered in heavy steel cylinders. With the transport network paralyzed, the resupply of these cylinders was nearly impossible. Doctors were forced to prioritize patients, creating a de facto triage system where only those with the highest chance of survival received mechanical ventilation or supplemental oxygen. The first data on mortality began to trickle into the Registrar General's office by late afternoon on December 7th. The figures were anomalous and terrifying. In the borough of Stepney, the death rate was recorded at 10 times the seasonal average. Unlike a typical epidemic, which targets specific age groups, this mass mortality event was hitting the very young and the very old with equal lethality. Infants, whose smaller airways were more easily obstructed by inflammation, were dying within hours of the onset of symptoms. The elderly, already weakened by the post-war winters, were succumbing to cardiac failure. By 6 p.m., the city's morgues had reached their 500-unit capacity, and hospital administrators were forced to use cold storage basements and even outdoor sheds to hold the overflow of bodies. The synthesis of these factors revealed a terrifying interaction between the environment and human biology. The lack of visibility prevented the movement of medical help, while the continued use of coal for warmth increased the concentration of the sulfuric acid that was causing the biological collapse. By 9 p.m., the city was in a state of silent mass casualty. Because the smog muffled sound and blocked sight, the scale of the dying was not yet visible to the public or the government. People were dying in their armchairs and beds, isolated by the black wall of the atmosphere, with their families often unaware of the severity of the situation until the person simply stopped breathing. As the night of December 7th deepened, the concentration of sulfur dioxide reached its absolute peak, hovering near 3.8 milligrams per cubic meter. The human body's ability to compensate for the lack of oxygen was reaching its limit. The city was now entering the most lethal phase of the 4-day inversion. The next 48 hours would be the darkest in London's modern history, as the pea souper transformed from a medical crisis into a full-scale humanitarian catastrophe. As the death toll climbed in silence, the chemical composition of the air was about to reach a concentration so high that it would physically change the acidity of the ground itself. The peak of the crisis was at hand, and the very concept of clean air was about to be born from the ashes of these dark days. At 12 p.m. on Sunday, December 7th, the concentration of sulfur dioxide in the air over central London reached a staggering 1.34 parts per million, a level nearly 7 times the standard winter average of the era. The meteorological trap had now been sealed for over 72 hours, and the atmosphere had reached a state of chemical saturation where the air was no longer a gas, but a heavy, suspended liquid of industrial waste. This was the peak of the crisis, a 48-hour window between the morning of December 7th and the evening of December 8th, during which the city experienced its highest mortality rate and the total failure of its visual environment. The core mechanism governing this peak was the cumulative buildup of pollutants within a fixed volume of air. Because the mixing height remained suppressed at approximately 200 feet, or 60 meters, there was no volume for new emissions to occupy. Every ton of coal burned by the 8 million residents added directly to the existing density. By Sunday afternoon, the smoke concentration had climbed to 4.46 milligrams per cubic meter. In technical terms, the London Basin had become a closed-loop system, where the output of the city's infrastructure was being directly re-inhaled by its population, without any dilution from the surrounding atmosphere. The technical deep dive into the air chemistry of these 2 days reveals a lethal transformation. In the early stages of the smog, the pollutants were primarily composed of soot and raw sulfur dioxide. However, by December 7th, the high humidity and the presence of trace metal catalysts from industrial smoke, such as iron and manganese, accelerated the oxidation of sulfur dioxide into sulfuric acid. This acid did not exist as a gas. It was dissolved into the fog droplets. These droplets were roughly 10 to 40 micrometers in diameter, the perfect size to be trapped in the upper and lower respiratory tracts. Londoners were not just breathing smoke, they were breathing a concentrated acidic mist with a pH level that some contemporary researchers estimated to be as low as 2.0, roughly equivalent to the acidity of lemon juice or stomach acid. The real-world impact of this chemical peak was most visible at the Smithfield Show, a major agricultural event taking place at Earl's Court. While the human toll was being recorded in hospitals, the prize-winning cattle provided a biological canary in the coal mine. By the morning of December 8th, the livestock began to collapse. Of the 350 cattle on display, over 50 required urgent veterinary attention, and 11 died within their pens. Post-mortem examinations of the animals revealed acute emphysema of the lungs, a direct result of the acidic aerosol destroying the lung tissue. The fact that these healthy, well-fed animals were dying in a sheltered indoor environment provided the first undeniable proof that the smog was not merely an irritant, but a systemic poison. The darkness of December 8th was absolute. At 10 a.m., the solar radiation reaching the ground was effectively zero. The oily soot was so thick that it absorbed the entire visible spectrum of light. Street lamps, which remained on 24 hours a day, were only visible as dim, reddish glows from a distance of less than 3 feet, or 1 meter. This created a phenomenon known as sensory deprivation shock among the population. People reported a total loss of the horizon line, leading to a form of terrestrial seasickness. The physical weight of the air was now measurable. The smog had a greasy, tactile quality that left a black residue on the skin and clothes that could only be removed with heavy solvents. The synthesis of these factors resulted in a complete breakdown of the city's remaining social functions. By 3 p.m. on December 8th, the London County Council began to receive reports that even the most basic emergency services had ceased to function. Fire brigades were unable to find fires, doctors were unable to find their patients, and the police were occupied entirely with preventing people from walking into the river or under the wheels of the few remaining moving vehicles. The economic cost of this two-day peak was estimated at millions of pounds, but the human cost was staggering. The death rate for Monday, December 8th was nearly 9 times higher than the average for the same day in 1951. The interaction between the extreme cold and the peak chemical concentration created a biological ceiling. The human heart and lungs could simply no longer extract enough oxygen from the acidic, soot-laden air to sustain life. The city had reached its breaking point. However, as the night of December 8th closed in, a subtle change in the barometric pressure began to register at the Greenwich Observatory. The high-pressure system that had held London captive was finally beginning to shift, signaling the arrival of a force that would eventually clear the air, but not before the true scale of the tragedy was revealed to the world. The end of the stagnation was approaching, but the physical and chemical damage to the city's population was already done. As the first signs of a change in the weather appeared, the focus would shift from survival to an assessment of the unprecedented damage left in the wake of the clearing winds. At 3 a.m. on Tuesday, December 9, 1952, the barometric pressure at the London Weather Centre began a rapid and decisive decline, falling from its stagnant peak of 1,030 millibars to 1,018 millibars. This shift signaled the collapse of the anticyclone that had held the Thames Valley in a meteorological vice for nearly 5 days. A freshening breeze from the southwest, measured at approximately 10 to 15 knots, or 11 to 17 miles per hour, 18 to 27 kilometers per hour, began to penetrate the dense, oily air mass. The meteorological trap was finally being dismantled by the return of horizontal atmospheric movement, a process known as advection. The core mechanism of the smog's dispersal was the reintroduction of turbulent mixing. For 4 days, the air had been stratified, with a layer of warm air sitting immovable over a pool of cold, toxic surface air. As the pressure gradient tightened, the incoming wind created mechanical turbulence. This turbulence began to chew at the edges of the inversion layer, mixing the concentrated pollutants with the cleaner, faster-moving air from the North Atlantic. For the first time since December 4th, the vertical lid over London was breached. The trapped sulfuric aerosol was not merely diluted, it was physically swept eastward toward the Thames estuary and out into the North Sea. A technical deep dive into the dispersal reveals the sheer mass of the material that was moved. It is estimated that during the clearing of December 9th, several thousand tons of suspended particulate matter and sulfur dioxide were flushed out of the London basin within a 6-hour window. As the wind speed increased, the mixing height, which had been suppressed to a mere 200 feet, or 60 meters, expanded rapidly to over 3,000 feet, or 900 meters. By 9 a.m., the visual range at Croydon Airport improved from 0 to over 1,000 yards, or 914 meters. The smoke shade that had blocked the sun for days finally dissipated, allowing the first weak rays of December sunlight to reach the streets of the West End. The real-world impact of the clearing wind was a surreal and grimy revelation. As the black curtain lifted, it revealed a city that had been physically transformed. London was coated in a thick, greasy film of carbon black and acidic residue. This was not the light, gray ash of a typical winter. It was a heavy, tar-like substance that adhered to every vertical and horizontal surface. Stone buildings, particularly those made of porous Portland limestone like St. Paul's Cathedral, showed immediate signs of chemical scabbing. The sulfuric acid in the smog had reacted with the calcium carbonate in the stone to form gypsum, which expanded and caused the surface of the historic monuments to flake and crumble. The initial estimates of the damage were centered on the economic and social paralysis, but the emerging mortality data quickly overshadowed the financial losses. By 12 p.m. on December 9th, as transport services began to resume a halting schedule, the General Register Office started to compile the death certificates from the preceding 4 days. The early figures were a statistical anomaly that shocked the Ministry of Health. In the week ending December 13th, the number of deaths in Greater London reached 4,703, compared to 1,852 in the same week the previous year. This initial assessment of 4,000 excess deaths would eventually be recognized as one of the greatest environmental disasters in recorded history, though later academic reviews would suggest the true toll, including delayed respiratory failures, was closer to 12,000. The synthesis of these factors shows that while the wind had cleared the air, it could not clear the biological and structural damage. The interaction between the nutty slack coal and the 4-day inversion had left a toxic legacy in the lungs of the survivors. Hospital admissions for pneumonia and bronchitis did not drop when the wind arrived. In fact, they continued to climb for another 48 hours, a phenomenon known as the mortality lag. The human body, having been subjected to a concentrated acidic aerosol for 96 hours, continued to fail even after the air was technically clean. The clearing wind of December 9th brought more than just visibility. It brought a profound sense of public and political shock. The pea souper, once viewed as a quirky, almost romantic feature of London life, was now exposed as a lethal byproduct of an unregulated industrial economy. As the city began the massive task of scrubbing the soot from its windows and streets, the conversation shifted from the weather to the law. The technical failure of the city's air management system was so absolute that it could no longer be ignored by the Parliament at Westminster. The physical crisis had passed, but the political storm was just beginning. The visibility was now clear enough for the public to see the graves of the thousands who had perished, and the demand for answers would lead to a radical transformation of how humanity relates to the very air it breathes. By January 1953, the Registrar General of the United Kingdom released a preliminary report confirming that the mortality rate in Greater London for the period of the Great Smog had reached approximately 4,000 excess deaths, triggering a political and scientific reckoning that would dismantle a century of industrial tradition. This figure, while staggering, was only the beginning of a long-term forensic investigation into the relationship between urban infrastructure and public health. The event had proven that the atmospheric capacity of a modern city was not infinite, and that the meteorological trap was a phenomenon that could and would recur unless the very chemistry of the city's energy supply was altered by law. The initial reaction from the government of Prime Minister Winston Churchill was one of strategic minimization. In early 1953, the Minister of Housing and Local Government, Harold Macmillan, faced intense questioning in the House of Commons regarding the lethality of the fog. The government's initial position was to categorize the event as an act of God, or a natural disaster exacerbated by an unusually cold winter, rather than a failure of policy. However, the technical data provided by the London County Council and various medical journals made this position untenable. For the first time, independent researchers presented evidence that the spike in mortality closely mirrored the daily concentrations of sulfur dioxide and smoke, creating a dose-response curve that directly linked coal combustion to mass death. In July 1953, under immense public pressure, the government appointed the Committee on Air Pollution, led by Sir Hugh Beaver. This body was tasked with a technical deep dive into the smoke problem. The Beaver Committee's findings, published in 1954, were revolutionary in their clarity and technical rigor. They estimated that air pollution cost the British economy £250 million per year in lost productivity, medical expenses, and damage to property. More importantly, the report identified that the primary culprit was not just the towering industrial chimneys of the East End, but the millions of individual domestic hearths burning nutty slack and other low-grade fuels. The committee concluded that ground-level emissions from homes were more dangerous because they were released at low altitudes, directly into the human breathing zone of 0 to 6 feet, or 0 to 2 meters. The legislative response to these findings was the Clean Air Act of 1956, a document that would become the blueprint for environmental law worldwide. The act introduced several core mechanisms to decouple the city's survival from its carbon output. First, it granted local authorities the power to establish smoke control areas. In these designated zones, it became a criminal offense to emit dark smoke from any chimney. To achieve this, the act provided government subsidies of up to 70% of the cost to help homeowners replace their traditional coal grates with modern appliances capable of burning smokeless fuels, such as anthracite, coke, or the increasingly popular domestic gas. Technically, the transition was a massive engineering undertaking. The act mandated that all new industrial furnaces be smokeless and required the height of new chimneys to be strictly regulated. The goal was to ensure that any remaining pollutants were released above the common inversion height of 500 feet or 150 meters, allowing for better atmospheric dispersion. This was a shift from localized pollution to a policy of dilution by altitude. Furthermore, the act incentivized the relocation of heavy power generation. Stations like Battersea and Bankside were gradually phased out or converted, with newer, larger coal plants being constructed in rural areas far from the stagnant air traps of the London Basin. The real-world impact of the 1956 Act was not immediate, but it was profound. By 1960, the average concentration of smoke in London's air had dropped by over 50%. The physical appearance of the city changed as well. The blackening of buildings slowed, and the visibility in winter months began to climb from hundreds of feet to miles or kilometers. The pea souper as a cultural and biological phenomenon began to fade into history. However, the technical legacy of the Great Smog extended far beyond the United Kingdom. The 1956 Act served as the direct inspiration for the United States Clean Air Act of 1963, and subsequent international treaties aimed at regulating sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides on a global scale. The synthesis of these historical factors reveals a pivot point in human civilization. Before December 1952, air was treated as a free resource for the disposal of waste. After the smog, air was redefined as a critical infrastructure component that required monitoring, regulation, and protection. The interaction between the infrastructure of coal and the meteorological trap had taught a lethal lesson: that the health of a population is inextricably linked to the chemical composition of its atmosphere. The 12,000 deaths now attributed to the 1952 event by modern epidemiologists were the heavy price paid for this realization. As we look back at the 1952 crisis through the lens of modern environmental science, the Great Smog remains the definitive case study in atmospheric threshold. It showed that a system can appear stable until a specific set of variables, an anticyclone, a low-grade fuel, and a geographical basin, align to create a lethal feedback loop. Today, while the coal smoke of London has been replaced by the invisible gases of modern transport, the fundamental physics of the trap remain the same. The Clean Air Act of 1956 was not the end of the struggle for breathable air, but it was the moment the world decided that the darkness of December 1952 must never be allowed to return. The sky over London is now clear, but the memory of the black aerosol remains etched into the stone of its monuments and the lungs of its history.